They told me that file would stay closed, that the pages would collect dust in a box until whoever controlled the dust decided otherwise. Tonight I am opening it, not for fame, not for a vendetta against secrecy. I am opening it because keeping it was a kind of theft, from memory, from a life that altered course the night 3 heavy knocks sounded at my cabin door, and something besides a man stood on my porch. My name is William Hart. I am a retired agent. Before that, for a long stretch, I was a park ranger. I carried a badge, a radio, a notebook. I learned how to follow a line of footprints through mud and snow, how to read the way a stream tells the story of a winter, how someone with bad intentions will always leave something behind they did not mean to. Those skills made me a good agent and a careful observer. They did not, however, prepare me for the look I saw that night, something equal parts dread and pleading, something incandescently alive behind a mask of hair. I will call what follows a statement. I write it as a man who is used to precise wording and careful record-keeping, but who is also a man who once learned that the world will not always bend to tidy sentences. When people ask why I stayed silent for so long, I tell them this. Some truths do their kindest work in quiet. There is more mercy in leaving certain things folded than in exposing them to the light of a market. I stayed silent to protect a life. I stayed silent to protect what I had learned in the thin years after my wife's death. That companionship can exist in the hollows we least expect. That boundaries drawn by language do not always account for the heart. It was October when I moved up to the Forest Service cabin on the western slope of Mount Hood. I had been living a life of small departures and careful avoidance, late-night graveside visits, a refrigerator of single-serving meals that I never learned to make properly, radio chatter that sounded like voices in a different house. Sarah had been gone 3 years. They always give you numbers first. Cancer, 16 months from diagnosis to memory. A slow hemorrhage that left a quiet in my bones I thought would never fill again. People assume that grief makes you reckless. For me, it made me deliberate. I wanted a place where the line between sunrise and sunset was decided by the angle of light on pine, not by fluorescent bulbs or deadlines. The Forest Service offered me the Gunnison Station, a weathered building of cedar and old glass perched above a cedar creek, a place where the maintenance budget was modest and the visitors were few. I took it because it kept me near the land I loved, because it offered a kind of ordinariness that could hold a man who felt decidedly unordinary. There are mornings I can still taste that first coffee I made in that cabin, a percolator that hissed like an old camp cook. I would strip yesterday's firebox of ash, set a new log, listen to the dog Duke pad across the hardwood like a small thunder. Duke came from my agency years, a German shepherd with half my patience and all the loyalty. He had been the single sane thread through the first year after Sarah's funeral. We developed routines like lovers: wake, coffee, walk the lower ridge, check the water lines, write a short note in the logbook, simple acts against the vastness. Personal log, OCT 3, 1998. Morning. Fog thick as wool. Duke chased a mink near the lower creek. I fixed the leaky pump line. Found a set of old snares by the west pitch. Rusted, likely years old. Left a note for the district crew. Coffee tasted like ash. Missed Sarah at noon. Missed her like a physical ache. I kept a journal back then not because I expected anyone to read it, but because the habit of writing had a way of making the days hold shape. The logbook was a palimpsest of weather and small duty. Removed broken sign on North Trail. Reported illegal campfire at Meadow. Checked trap lines, none active. The language was functional. It held the kind of facts a man trained in observation can rely on when memory clouds. People imagine the woods as a refuge where grief is soothed by the music of rivers and the geometry of trees. That is part of it. But grief has a way of changing the scale of ordinary things. The drip of condensation on a window can sound like a footstep at night. A certain angle of light will remind you of the way a cheek looked in sleep. I was learning how to live with ghosts threaded into every small task. The first time I wrote file on a page, it felt almost comical. The word carried a gravity I didn't want. Bureaucracy applied to a life that was disintegrating at the edges. I used the term as a private joke, then as a shield. Personal file, Hart. I documented weather, the occasional stranger at the trailhead, Duke's vaccine dates. I wrote the things a man with a habit for records wrote. And, 2 months after my arrival, I wrote an entry that would not have been out of place in a stranger's novel. Except it had happened, and my hand was the only witness. Personal file. Oct. 18, 1999. 23:02 hours. 3 knocks at cabin. Duke went silent before he barked. That quiet was the first alarm. Door opened. Found an animal on porch. Large, bipedal, fur dark as wet coal. Limb injured with steel snare embedded just above the left knee. Eyes, unexpected, human in recognition, mouth partially open from breath and pain. Removed snare with bolt cutters from truck. Bandaged wound. Animal accepted food and shelter. Will keep observation. No official report filed pending assessment. Signed, W. Hart. A lot happens in the space between a knock and the opening of a door. The mind runs a system of rapid possibilities. A neighbor in need, a hunting party in error, a prankster with a bottle. The cold that night was immediate and bone sharp, the kind that thrusts breath into visible strings and makes your teeth ache. The wood stove in the cabin had just died down. I remember the thin orange of the ember. Duke's hackles rose in what might have been instinct, or perhaps memory. He knew the difference between a county trespasser and something else. The 3 knocks were not the polite tap of a neighbor. They were heavy and deliberate, each one a small percussion that sounded at an odd interval. Think of a slow drum trying to keep time with wind. They had weight. The first knock made my stomach tighten. The second pulled me from the chair as if by an invisible cord. The third landed with the near certainty that whatever waited outside was no stranger to the world. My training told me to be cautious. My instinct said to open the door a crack and speak. I did both at once. Duke scrabbled beside me, pressed to my leg. The porch light threw a circle of amber. Beyond it, the white of fog and pines and the suggestion of larger shapes. There are moments when everything you have learned becomes a small, insufficient thing. It was like that then. She looked up at me from the threshold, as if she had been expecting a particular person. That detail haunts me most. The recognition. Her face was framed by thick, dark hair shot through with frost and lighter strands. Her features obscured, but immediately expressive. She was large, taller than a man of average height. But her posture held a kind of dignity that erased monstrous caricatures. The snare clung to her left knee, cutting into flesh. Blood matted the fur. She smelled like pine sap and cold earth, and an undertow of something more complex. A scent I knew in no human way, but that translated in my skull to fear. Her eyes met mine and held. They were not simply reflective. They were reasoning. I have seen the same look in people who are dying and in people who are asking forgiveness. There was in that glance an appeal I could not, in good conscience, ignore. I could have radioed for help. I could have taken a picture. I could have locked the door and called for backup, scheduled an impersonal removal or a controlled response. I didn't. The decision was not dramatic. It came like a second breath. I am not proud of every choice I have made. I am proud of this one for the reasons that will be apparent in the pages to come. When you have been through the slow deracination of losing a person you loved, you become used to the idea that the right thing isn't always the sanctioned thing. I collected the bolt cutters from the truck and set them on the porch between us. Tools have a language of their own. Metal clinks, leather straps whisper. She watched the cutters with a kind of animal focus, then tenderly, as if afraid my motion might make the world recoil, extended her thick, calloused hand. The hand itself was nearly human in shape. 5 fingers, thumb opposable, hair tapering back. Her palm was as large as my own, and just as warm. Removing the snare was not as simple as one reads in books. The metal had embedded itself into tissue. It had bitten through fur and skin and was rusted in one place. I wrapped my gloved hand in a bandana and felt the small tremors under the fur. Her breath hitched. She did not, as the movies promise, lash out or flee. She trusted a little, perhaps compelled by survival, perhaps moved by a recognition we might call empathy. When the bolt cutters finally yielded with a small snapping sound, she made a noise that might have been gratitude or relief or something between speech and wind. Inside the cabin, I washed the wound the best I knew how. I had a field kit left over from years of rangers' lectures: saline, gauze, a roll of adhesive tape, some antiseptic ointment. I laid the wound open to the light of the lamp and felt a surge of old competence, the competence of hands that had stitched hikers' torn flesh back together and bound the wounds of animals caught in wire. I think she knew I was doing what I could. She trembled once and then settled into the blanket I spread on the floor near the stove. Duke accepted her presence with the dignity of a man who knows his place and understands that sometimes alliance is a quiet thing. We stayed like that into the small hours. I brewed tea, though she would not drink from a cup. She sampled berries and a piece of the salted fish I kept for emergencies. I found myself talking to her, because movement in the dark begets speech. I told her, without thinking how ridiculous it sounded, that Sarah had liked the same view from the east window. I told her that if she stayed long enough, the mountain would teach her when to sleep and when to watch, when to hold back and when to step forward. There is an intimacy in tending to another creature that is not papal or holy, but practical and human. I wrapped the wound with gauze and tape, securing the bandage with awkward tenderness. She looked at me while I worked, blinking slowly as if cataloging my touch. When I finished, she lifted her head and pressed it into my boot like a small, immense animal curl. It was the first physical act of trust. I sat on the floor and felt the warmth of her body against the wood, understood that this moment would not be undone by anything as petty as disbelief. Personal file. Oct 19, 1999. 02:30 hours. Animal slept in cabin through first night. Observed respiratory rate normal. No fever. Ate small portions. Responded to nameless call. Approach with caution. No external aggression observed. Decision. No official report. Rationale. To prevent capture, harassment, and allow recovery. Signed. The choice not to report was not made in contempt of protocol. It was made in sorrow and calculation. I knew the machinery of response in the forest. Specialized units, media interest, opportunistic academics, cruel curiosity. I had seen what publicity did to fragile things. There are live creatures that are best kept from the glare for their physical safety. There are creatures, people included, that cannot survive being made into a spectacle. Morning arrived on a thin blade of gold. The creature had not left the porch during the night. She watched through the window as I stoked the stove and boiled water, the light changing the angles of her face. When she did move, it was with the deliberate slowness of a person on the verge of great care. She would not let me inspect the wound with any depth that day, but she allowed me to rewrap the bandage and to leave food at a certain distance. She marked the space in which she consented to human intervention. Over the next few days, patterns began to emerge. She came at dusk, always after the sun reduced the pines to silhouettes. She did not sleep inside anymore, but would sit on the low rock by the porch and watch me until the last light vanished, and then she'd retreat into the dark, leaving small traces. A flattened patch of moss where she had lain, a scattering of crushed berries, the occasional rounded stone placed at the path's edge. She seemed to prefer to remain almost at the periphery of my life, like an important memory that does not demand to be fully relived. Personal file. Oct 24, 1999. Night visitation pattern established. She leaves small tokens, stones, bark. Appears to remove any active snares encountered near game trails. Observed set on North Ridge removed and dismantled by hand. Unknown if intentional intervention or territorial behavior. Will continue monitoring. Signed. At first I thought the token stones were an oddity. I thought maybe they were tools or markers. Then one evening I followed the trail she often took, stepping soft where she stepped softer, and found the North Ridge cleared of a fresh snare. The wire lay in a neat coil at the base of a lodgepole. The knot had been cut. Someone had been there recently, not by the hand of a neighbor, not by a Forest Service crew. The pattern of the cut and the placement of the coil were such that they could have been reassembled, if one's intent was deception. My training told me to look for odor, hair, any trace of human presence. There were boot prints in the mud further down, shallow and angled. They matched a size and tread consistent with hunter's boots. A small private fury grew in me. I had spent years drawing lines between those who respected the forest and those who exploited it. Illegally set snares are a cruel, indiscriminate instrument. They do not ask about the name or the worth of whom they injure. The thought of someone setting snares in a place where a wounded, intelligent, injured creature might stumble was intolerable. I thought of my wife's hands, steady, sure, and imagined the same hands set to cutting wire late at night on a ridge. It is a terrible thing to be a good man and be forced to consider violence in defense of a life you have sworn not to expose. We adapted a code for ourselves, she and I. She would come when the light receded. I would leave bowls of water and dry fish at the cabin's edge. We moved in a choreography of trust. I maintained the boundaries she did not cross. She performed acts that suggested comprehension of my ethics, removing snares, dismantling traps and hidden runs, guiding me once to a small clearing where she had apparently stashed a cache of food like a squirrel caches nuts. There was a maternal economy in her actions. She not only competent remedied the snares but hid other dangers. She was an agent of survival in her own right. It is hard to write the tenderness of those months without turning it into something else. Tenderness is not a romance. It is the small, patient actions that define a life. She would tap the side of the boxcar window as if to tell me something. She would slide a small bone across the porch boards toward my boot as if an offering, and then turn away with a shy, deliberate gait. Once she dragged a blanket to the place where I had stored my old jacket and arranged it with a care that suggested understanding of comfort. We were not partners in a human sense. We were two creatures finding common practice in a wilderness of distance. Personal File, Nov 12, 1999. Established routine, nightly visits. Animal shows signs of higher cognitive pattern. Tool manipulation observed. Deliberate removal of snares near trails. Responds to whistle-like call, attempting to train response for monitoring. Plan. Continue non-invasive observation. Maintain secrecy to protect subject. Signed. There were nights when I would sit with my back to the window and watch as she moved through the trees with a grace that made the rest of my life seem clumsy. There were mornings when I would find her sitting on a rock, carefully inspecting a broken reed, her head tilted in an almost human fashion. I made no effort to name her. Names are dangerous when you are trying to hold something in private. I wrote a date in the logbook when she arrived and when she left. The dates became the spine of an account that, in time, felt more crucial than anything in my career. It would be dishonest to say the months that followed were without fear. There were times when I would awake to the distant crack of a tree and think of a hunter's rifle. There were snatches of radio traffic, other stations noting increased foot traffic on the lower trail, a report of fresh campfires where none should be, a mention of men passing through with guns. We are not an island. The mountain is awash of human needs and human greed. The more I learned of her intelligence, the more I feared the human appetite for spectacle. One night late in November, a storm came that thinned the air in a way that made the world feel like a closed fist. The wind found the weak places in the cabin's old seams and made them sing. The stove belched and then steadied. I had stacked enough wood to last through the worst, or so I thought. Duke slept on the rug. The creature did not come at dusk that night. I stayed awake till the blackness felt like a living thing, then fell into a fitful sleep with the radio on, listening to the static for human voices. At 3 in the morning I woke to an urgent rustle at the porch. Duke stood bristling. Before I could move, the door thudded twice with a force that made the walls vibrate. This was not a call of a friend. It was the sound of something with no patience left. I opened the door and found her under a spray of ice, her left leg slick with frozen blood. The snare had tightened again, mangled now by newly set wire, as if someone had returned and tried to finish a cruel job. Her breathing was fast and shallow, her head tossed back and forth as if listening for something I couldn't hear. Whatever fear I had about breaking protocol dissolved into the single fact that she was present and suffered. I moved without hesitation. Bolt cutters again, a roll of gauze, antiseptic. I worked under the wind's slap and the threatening fall of snow. She made a sound that was part inhale, part human moan. When I finally freed the wire, I saw that the flesh beneath had been torn and begun to stiffen with cold. I sweated under my jacket even as the air numbed my fingers. We got her inside by the leverage of a small sled and my 2 hands. It took an afternoon that felt like a lifetime. Once inside, I wrapped her wound as best I could and built a bed of blankets behind the stove. She coughed once and then slept like a child. There's a kind of intimacy in nursing a wound that borders on sacrament. The repetitive cleaning, the smell of alcohol, the feel of grime lifting from skin, the soft murmur one keeps up to fill the silence. I think both of us were keeping vigil for different kinds of loss. Personal file, Nov 28, 1999. Emergency admission to cabin. Severe wound on left hind limb. Re-injury likely from fresh snare. Treatment, debridement, antibiotics administered, amoxicillin field dose, bandage changed twice daily, animal responds to touch, respiration stabilized. Concern, humans may be setting traps deliberately in area. Action, night patrols, set humane traps to collect evidence of trespassers. Do not publicize subject. Signed. I made a choice then to begin documenting in a slightly different register. If I was to keep her secret, I owed it to her to be responsible in that secrecy. I took photographs, just the bandage and the wound, for my notes, using a disposable camera I had kept in the glove compartment for emergencies. I marked the prints and filed them in an envelope with dates. I set up a path of small markers leading to places where snares had been found, then dismantled them and took the coils into a locked storage box. I watched the trails for footprints and found, in the soft ground beyond the creek, prints that were not deer. They were shoe-like imprints, deep, with a tread pattern I would later match to a local brand of hunting boot. There is a moral equation one must balance when secrecy is chosen. You protect a life, and thereby assume responsibility for risks that might have been mitigated by oversight. The calculus is never neat. I told myself that publicity would attract the curious, the cruel, and the professional. I told myself that the forest had been a place of mercy for creatures without a place to be safe. I told myself many things at night to ward off the guilt, and yet, whenever I closed the lid on the storage box that held the snares wire, a small, raw anxiety would creep into my throat. The winter that followed was brutal in its own patient way. Snow packed the trails. The radio's reach shortened to snippets of static and voices that came through as if from underwater. The nights were long and the stove demanded a good faith effort. I learned to read the mountain's moods, where a snowdrift would break, which ridge would shed avalanches. She helped in ways that were small and irreplaceable. Once she led me, with a series of hoots and taps, to a place where a dead hemlock had trapped a small cache of food. Seeds and the remains of salmon left by some small herd. She understood, in an economic sense, how to provide. I never attempted to collar her or to force her into human parlance. There were nights when I would whistle a low pattern and she would come. I began to notice that she reacted to certain tones, pitch, rhythm, like a learned response. I learned her rhythms. She learned mine. There was a kind of diplomacy that grew between us. A consent-based code that we both observed. When the darkness seemed to press upon my cabin windows, and the howl of the wind sounded like a distant chorus, her presence on the porch was a kind of ordinance against despair. Personal file. Deck 20, 1999. Winter storms increasing. Subject remains nocturnal visitor. Demonstrates intentional removal of traps and assistance in locating food caches. Behavior suggests high cognitive functioning and capacity for long-term memory. Recognizes cabin and responses to whistle. Continue to monitor. Maintain secrecy. Signed. I am telling this now because the life of the thing that lived outside my door changed the shape of my grief. The months after Sarah died were a slow grinding toward acceptance, a calculus of what to keep and what to let go. What I found on that porch, beneath the frost and old wire, was not a replacement. That would have been impossible. It was rather a different species of companionship, an exchange measured in tarps, food, a cleaned wound, and a carved bone that she left on my step the first spring. The carved bone was small, smooth to a shape that fitted the curve of my palm. There was a deliberate pattern etched into it, not unlike the kind of markings one might find on an indigenous tool, lines and notches arranged not for ornament but for meaning. She placed it near my boot as if bestowing a blessing and then retreated into the trees. I kept that bone in my jacket pocket for months. It was the only thing she ever gave me directly, and it felt heavier with meaning than any official commendation I had ever held. I had reasons, each more defensible than the last, to maintain silence. I also had reasons grounded in fear, of men with guns, of opportunists, of bureaucrats who would reduce living mystery to a scientific footnote. I had been through a world where the next logical step was often the least merciful. I knew the machinery of curiosity. It can be a machine of good, but also a monster. Protecting something living from that machine felt, to me, like a moral duty. Personal file, Jan 5, 2000. Token received, small carved bone left on porch. Indicates possible symbolic communication. Subject exhibits maternal behaviors. Presence of unknown human footprints near traps continues. Consider controlled surveillance for evidence of trespassers while keeping subject's location confidential. Signed. When the trials of duty and morality tangle, the shape of your decisions often reflects the different loyalties you carry inside. I was loyal to Sarah's memory. I was loyal to the oath that had trained me to protect the vulnerable. I was loyal now, strangely and profoundly, to a creature that had learned to trust me with something most people never have the honor to steward. It changed my routine, sure, but it also changed the scale on which I measured harm. If a sound sleep for that creature meant a risk to my professional reputation, I would gladly accept the small indignities of rumor. There was another factor that complicated the equation: the presence of other people on the mountain. Word travels, and where there is word there is also appetite. In the months that followed, I began to notice more than boots. Someone had left a string of baited traps near a game trail that had never seen such instruments before. The wire smelled faintly of machine oil and human hands. There were scratched marks on trees that suggested the crude use of a knife. I collected the evidence, cataloged it in my file, and for the first time felt a real fear that the secret would not remain secret through no fault of mine, but because of a human appetite that did not require my permission to act. I started patrolling at night more often. Duke and I walked the ridge with a flashlight and the kind of silence that expects danger. On one of those nights I found 2 sets of prints, boot tread, and what looked like the print of a small vehicle pressed into the clearing. Near the edge of the trail was a length of bright orange cord used to secure game. Someone had been here. That knowledge settled on me like ice water. Personal file, Feb 2, 2000. Evidence of human trespass increasing. Found fresh snares set on side trails and evidence of bait. Placed snares wire in secured storage. Increased night observation. Consider options. Local law enforcement involvement would risk exposure. Agency involvement could protect subject but may also draw attention. Ethical conflict unresolved. Signed. I will stop here for a moment to say what should be obvious and what should be emphasized. The choice to protect another life does not absolve one from the difficulties of that protection. It does not insulate you from the consequences of others' curiosity. It does not provide an easy script for what happens when hunters and greed arrive like weather. It simply means you are willing to accept the weight those consequences may bear. I had not imagined how long the wait could be, nor had I imagined how deep the small kindnesses would burrow into me. She started to do things that felt distinctly deliberate, dislodging snares set on common game trails, leaving small caches of collected berries in places I would find them, and once, in a moment that always warms and pains me to recall, guiding a broken-legged deer away from a wire and into a grove where it could hide. It was not charity in the human sense. It was competence extended to another creature's life, a species-level ingenuity that taught me how little we own the world and how much we might be able to learn if we sat down and listened. Personal file, Feb 14, 2002. Observed subject guiding crippled ungulate to shelter and warning via vocalization when human presence noted. Demonstrates protective behavior toward ecosystem inhabitants. Consider moral imperative to increase monitoring without exposing subject. Signed. There are, in the years since, nights when those early months raise in me the desire to shout everything I know from every mountaintop. Mostly I have been content to keep the file sealed, to carry the small carved bone in my pocket when I travel, to tell the story to a select few who knew Sarah and who understood what it means to protect memory. But secrets have a way of outliving their uses. They calcify into guilt if they are not occasionally aired and examined. That is why, in the following months when tracks and traps multiplied and the mountain's polite distance allowed for the shape of malice, I found myself moving toward a decision that would alter both of our lives. I will end this part of the record at a hinge point. The evidence of human trespass increased, my nights grew longer, and the thing on my porch, no longer merely a curiosity, but an ally and a living being with a maternal economy, would eventually force me to consider whether secrecy remained the safest option. The decision I made then was not an easy one. It required that I balance the life of a creature who trusted me against the bureaucracy and curiosity of the world I came from. Tonight, as I set down these words, the carved bone lies on the table beside my lamp. The fire outside is a hush. I have kept the file closed all these years because silence was the gentlest form of care I could offer. But a life kept hidden is not always a life well kept. There are choices ahead that will test the promise I made on that porch. The promise to guard rather than expose. And when those choices come, I will have to decide if protection means continued secrecy, or if the price of silence is in fact a different kind of harm. If you want to hear the whole file, stay with me. I am only beginning to tell you what happened after the snares multiplied, after the storm that tore the ridge, after the men with the bright boots left the marks they did not intend to leave. There were arrests later of men caught with illegal traps, things I will recount carefully. There was a night when the station received an order to close. There was a carved bone exchange and a farewell that felt like a vow. For now the mountain keeps its own counsel. I keep mine, but neither can hold against the tide forever. The tide arrived not like a single wave, but like a slow gathering weather system, small incidents stacking into an inevitability. In late winter the trap finds grew bolder, moved closer to the creek, then into a contour of trail that I had assumed only deer and people with licenses ever trod. I found a cluster of snares one morning laid in a sloppy crescent, the wire bright against the snow, bait crushed into the hollow where game might pass. Whoever had set them had no patience for concealment or care for the life they risked. That kind of thoughtless cruelty has a rhythm to it. You learn to feel it in the way the wind lifts odor off the snow and carries a human scent like a ribbon. One night in March, Duke wouldn't leave the threshold. He lay with his head across my boots and blinked at the door with a look that was half complaint, half command. I had mapped the recent pattern of snares and footprints to a rough grid in my head, and had been walking that grid at odd hours. My sleep was a series of short sentences. Woke, checked, reset, returned. The mountain places a premium on repetitive labor. Life goes on in rhythms you often have to supply yourself. On that night I found fresh boot tracks crossing the creek in a hurried stamp, the pattern of a rubber sole I recognized from a catalog of things. They ran up the slope to the north, and where they broke out of tree line, they circled and doubled as if to hide something. Not a big blind, not a careful trap. Cricket in the mud. Unwound cord. Flashes of orange fabric snagged in branches. The human signature of haste. 2 sets of prints. One larger, a heavy heel, and one smaller, more nimble. A vehicle had been parked at the service road that morning, its imprint pressed into the thawing ruts. Whoever it was had work to do, and no patience for secrecy. Personal file. Mar 7, 2000, 23:05 hours. Located fresh human activity. 2 boot patterns crossing creek, evidence of vehicle from service road. Discovered multiple newly set snares intended for game. No direct evidence of weapon discharge. Recommend immediate increased night patrols. Consider involving local law enforcement for illegal trapping. Assess risk to subject. Signed. There is a moment when the ethical ledger you keep shifts weight. The argument that secrecy shields fragile life is loss-bearing until the day the predators you fear move in with nets and cord. I called the county sheriff. This was not my first referral, and the local deputies were practical. I gave them a careful account of what I had seen without all the adjectives that might make them search for mythology. I told them about the snares and the footprints in the vehicle. I omitted the reason I was particularly worried. I didn't name what I was trying to keep secret. It was a partial truth in service of a larger duty, to keep the mountain safe without putting that which needed protection into reach of the hungry. A deputy came up the following dusk with his partner and an orderly professional look. He asked questions about the trail, about the time window, about the possibility that hunters were moving through. I gave him the grid and the prints and the path to the hidden coil of wire I had recovered. He listened, and for a moment I thought the right thing might be done. Patrols established, snares confiscated, a watch. He nodded and said the right phrases about trespass and illegal trapping. But experience taught me to keep my enthusiasm in check. Men like to believe they solve problems with paperwork. The mountain solves problems with time and weather and the slow attention of those who know it. 2 nights later, the deputy radioed me. The men had been stopped at the lower service road, trying to push their truck up onto a feeder trail. There had been a set of snares slung over the tailgate. The deputy's voice on the radio was low, practical. He said simply, "We have them." Later, he would tell me they had more than snares. Orange tape, a small drag lynch, the remains of bait sacks. They did not have weapons out, he insisted. But weapons had a way of being nearby where traps are. He asked if I would come in to identify the wires and if I would be willing to sign a statement. I did. The arrest was procedural and in some ways anticlimactic. 2 men churned in the cold, breath steaming, cuffs glinting in the low light. Their faces were not caricatures. They were 2 men who looked like a lifetime of bad choices could produce. Sunburned, lined, the sort of squint that comes from waiting for things to go right. One of them swore at the cuffs. The other wept once, briefly, as if he had been struck by the absurdity of his own arrest. They were charged with illegal trapping and trespass. In court later, they would plead a messy combination of ignorance and bad judgment. The law does not always render justice in ways your heart wants it to, but sometimes it does what it can. I drove back to the cabin after giving my signed statement. The road smelled of melting frost and diesel. The sky was a flat, indifferent gray. Duke slept in the back seat, his head a small, warm weight on the upholstery. I had been careful in the conversation with the sheriff to make the men the problem, and not to make myself the catalyst. That balance is brittle and necessary. When I opened the door, the porch was empty. The snow at its edge had been flattened where she'd rested before, and near the step lay a small pile of moss, not unlike a child's offering. The carved bone was still in my pocket, a familiar weight. Personal file, Mar 11, 2000. Arrests made by county for illegal trapping. 2 individuals taken into custody, snares and related paraphernalia confiscated. Court action pending. Subject did not approach during confrontation. No evidence of direct human-subject contact at time of arrests. Continued secrecy recommended. Signed. The next evening she came to the porch and watched me as if to say without words that something had happened. She moved in slow arcs, inspecting the places where snares once were, sniffing at the coil of confiscated wire I had left in the storage locker. When she laid her great hand on the step and left the tiny bone that had been in my pocket for months, the gesture was both private and intimate. She did not press her face to the wood as she had before. She only sat and watched while the sky turned the blue of old China. The arrests did not end the problem. The men were fined and returned to their lives. Human appetite has a way of adapting around regulations. There were whispers in the valley of reports and strange things, and men carrying wire. The Forest Service brass, who normally measure their days in fiscal quarters and mitigation plans, began to notice the uptick in unauthorized activity on the service roads. That uptick led to a meeting that smelled of coffee and a kind of paper-worn fatigue. The meeting was a typical bureaucratic thing, a long table, folders, the gravity of budgets. It was impossible not to think of the care I had taken, the hours I had kept, in the light of those fluorescent bulbs. The district manager asked questions about liability and public safety. He read aloud phrases that had been printed in a manual meant to govern every contingency except the one I had been stewarding. He asked whether there were conservation concerns and whether events should be communicated to headquarters. I listened to the dispassionate language of people who have the responsibility for many things, not all of them simple. I also listened to the drone of worry that comes when funding and risk collide. They proposed a rotating patrol, a media release about increased oversight, and blandly, an offer to convert the Gunnison post into an unmanned check-in, reassigning personnel to busier stations. There was money to be saved with fewer remote posts and a better allocation of resources. It was the sort of logic that keeps an organization alive, but sometimes at the expense of the small local truths that do not fit the spreadsheet. Personal file, APR2, 2000. District meeting. Assessment recommends closing Gunnison Station as an occupied post and replacing with intermittent patrols due to budget constraints. Possible transfer offer extended to current post occupant. Potential risk. Reduced human presence may increase vulnerability to trespassers and reduce protective capacity for subject. Recommend consideration of alternative staffing or community partnerships to ensure continued oversight. Signed. When they mentioned the phrase transfer, it landed like a stone. I had always known the possibility existed. A station closure is not a personal surprise. Yet the thought that my capacity to watch would be reduced to an intermittent patrol made something in my chest tighten. The offer they extended was framed with the courtesy of a person making a professional transition. Reassignment to a regional hub with more regular hours, or a retirement package if I preferred it. They did not know the weight of the secret I had held for months. They knew only the metrics. There came a night when I walked out to the porch and found in the snow a perfect oval of crushed grass arranged like a nest. Inside it lay a small bundle of hair and an imprint of nails that looked for all the world like a child's hand. The sight made my chest lift and fall in ways I couldn't account for. The grip of protective obligation tightened. If the station closed, the mountain's guardianship would thin, and that would put at risk the thing I had promised to keep safe. I thought long and hard about my options. I could argue against the closure and ask for special dispensation. I could reveal what I knew, a wholesale airing of the file in the name of protection, and perhaps secure a watchful oversight that would keep the creature safe under human stewardship. Or I could accept the change and carry the secret elsewhere, live in transit between caring and neglect. Each option had costs. Each option had the power to tear the fragile fabric of trust that had grown between me and the creature. There was a last evening we shared that I have carried like a relic. The cabin smelled of stew and the faint smoke of the stove. Snow fell beyond the small panes of glass, quiet and tireless. She came as she always did at dusk, but that night she did not sit on the rock. She moved to the door and sat, and when I opened the door she stepped inside without urging. The unusually intimate gesture of entering my space felt like an invitation. She pressed her weight against my legs, leaned her head gently into my thigh, and made a sound that had always struck me somewhere between a syllable and wind. We sat in the silence of shared presence until the stove sang thinly and the light congealed into shadow. I took the carved bone from where I had hidden it and set it on the table. She watched me with the careful patience of someone who had watched me through wounds and storms. Then, with a tenderness that made my fingers shake, she reached out with that enormous hand and took the bone, turning it over and over, as if inspecting a manuscript. When she placed it back beside my cup, she had made into its surface a new mark, an additional groove, a notch I had not seen before, cut small and precise like the making of a promise. Personal file. APR 18, 2000 hours. Subject present at cabin. Final personal contact prior to station closure decision. Exchange of token with new marking. Subject responds with prolonged physical contact. Emotional impact on observer high. Decision pending on transfer retirement. Signed. There are certain gifts you keep because they are not possessions but contracts. That bone, newly notched, felt like a vow. I slept badly that last night with the stove dwindling and Duke at the foot of the bed, warm and unlikely in his old age. Morning arrived like an accountant, factual and unromantic. The transfer offer sat in my inbox with the sterile calm of an email subject line. To remain would be to risk the watch that had protected something rare. To leave would be to risk losing the daily ability to intervene. The calculus felt like a choice between two forms of violence. I chose retirement. It was not a heroic decision. It was not either a betrayal. The choice to leave was an acknowledgement of limits and an attempt to place care in the hands of a life lived without the daily certainty of my presence. I signed the retirement paper with a hand that still knew the patient loops of a good signature. They sat it as mutual separation and thanked me for my years of service. In a less romantic era, it was called redundancy. The night before I left, she came early and sat near the step. I wrapped my jacket around my shoulders and stepped outside into a thin rain that smelled of crushed wood. We stood there for a long time without speech. I had stacked my gear into the Bronco, a small box of my notes, the carved bone wrapped in an oilcloth, a duffel of clothes, the old field kit. My keys made a small private clatter. When I leaned down, she pushed her forehead into my hand, leant into me as if to transmit her memory through bone and skin. For a wild creature that had allowed me the care of its body and the keeping of its trust, this was an enormous tenderness. I left no trail. I told no one where I would go. The county deputies knew only that I was moving on. The carved bone sat on the seat beside me, cold and somehow full. I drove down the service road with Duke sleeping against the seat and the radio playing something indifferent about weather. The mountain rolled away in layers, and with each mile I felt a tiny part of the duty I had been bearing peel away. I promised, in the way of men who hold secrets, to write the story down and to keep it sealed. I meant it. Personal file, May 3rd, 2000. Retirement executed. Personal effects removed from post. Subject last observed at porch prior to departure. Gave tactile contact. Condition of subject unknown following departure. Carved bone retained. Decision. Maintain file sealed pending future assessment of subject welfare. Signed. Years accrued like the quiet stacking of driftwood. I moved to a gray town on the valley floor, took a job part-time consulting on trail safety, and answered emails from former colleagues. Life in small towns is measured in errands and neighborly exchanges, in the way the library closes and the coffee shop knows your order. I would take the carved bone from time to time and turn it over, feeling the notch that had been made before I left. It was a relic and a promise and a wound all at once. Every spring for a decade I drove back to that ridge to check for footprints in the melt. I would leave a grain of rice in the hollow of a rock, an offering intended for a friend rather than a human. Nothing dramatic happened. Sometimes I would find traces, flattened moss patches, a widened trail, or a piece of bark scraped in a way that suggested a living hand. Other times, months passed in silence, and the long ache of absence returned like an old tide. Personal file. Aug 14, 2003. Periodic checks on area post-retirement show intermittent signs of subject presence, flattened areas and occasional scraps of fur observed. No direct human contact. Recommend continued non-invasive monitoring if feasible. Signed. Life as it does demanded adjustments. My children, Jennifer and Marcus, had their own lives and did not always meet my rhythms. We spoke, at intervals richly filled with the particularities of adult distance. They knew I had retired, and that I had lived in the forest for a long while. They did not know the details of the carved bone or the nights by the stove. Some things I had resolved were mine to carry. A decade slid toward 2. The bone grew smooth from being held in my pockets. The notch, when I rubbed my thumb across it, felt like a small language between two beings. The mountain remained a place of memory, and for all my worry, of quiet preservation. Then, one late autumn, in a way that surprised me with the simple force of weather, I felt the pull to return for more than token checks. I was older, my hair threaded with a color that made strangers comment kindly. I had a doctor's appointment bookmarked in a folder and a neighbor who borrowed my ladder for no good reason. Yet something in me, some rust-softened oath, wanted the closure that the presence of that life could offer. Not closure in the sense of end, closure in the sense of completeness. I drove north with the carved bone wrapped in the oilcloth, tucked in a cup holder, the road an old friend. It had been 8 years since I had left the cabin as a place of work. The Bronco's suspension complained at the private roads. The radio aired nothing of consequence. The world had changed. Newer cars, different road signs, a cell phone signal that flickered like a poor candle in the hollow of the valley. I felt the thin agitation of expectation. I was not sure who I would be when I found what I went looking for. An old man hoping for recognition, an ex-agent seeking evidence, or simply a person who had promised. The cabin stood, weathered in the way of any building that has been cared for and then left to its own devices. Moss at the corners, a lean in the porch rail, a chimney patina that had warmed many winters. There were new scars. Someone had nailed a replacement shutter and left a rough patch of lumber on the north face. I parked the Bronco and stepped out. The air was a tart mix of cold and sap. I had come with food and a small toolkit. I had come also with the knowledge that my presence might mean little and mean everything. Personal file, Nov 2, 2008. Return visit initiated after extended period away. Objective, non-invasive assessment for signs of subject presence and welfare. Approach with caution and respect. Maintain discretion. Signed. At dusk I sat on the steps with nothing but a thermos of coffee and Duke's quiet company. We had practiced this arrangement before. The sun slid behind the ridge, and the light turned to a color that somehow makes every resting thing more beautiful. I listened for her. The sound of a heavy footfall through leaves, a safe knock on wood. I heard only the small, familiar calls of birds and the settling of the house in the cool. My breath steamed. And then, as if the mountain had simply decided that certain promises accrue interest, she came. She stepped from the tree line with a gait both familiar and new. She was not alone. At her flank trotted a smaller figure, half her height and twice as curious. A juvenile, its hair matted with long-forgotten pine needles, its eyes bright and appraising. The first sight of the child was like meeting a portrait of time, proof that life goes on, that the questions of lineage and legacy matter to the world as much as they matter to us. She paused at the edge of the porch, then ambled up and placed both hands on the rail. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, as if recognition were something you could measure by muscle memory, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to the wood beside me. The small one sat back and watched with an attention that made me long for simple translations. It cocked its head and emitted a single inquisitive sound like a soft drum. I felt something break open in me. I had expected trepidation and instead found a tidal, tender thing, relief. She remembered my hand. She remembered the shape of my walk. Whether the memory was simply the imprint of repeated patterns or something like gratitude, I could not have said. What I could say was this. The connection between us was real, and it had not been erased by time. The younger one edged forward, placed a small palm against the step, and then, with the boldness of the young, pushed a tentative finger toward my boot. It smelled, in a way that made the old circuits in my chest hum, of pine and the mountain's amber. It seemed unafraid. I found my hand without thinking, moving to the child's small palm. Its skin was warm and coarse, and it held my finger, as if anchoring itself to a story. Personal file, Nov 3, 2008. Reunion observed. Subject accompanied by juvenile individual, estimated offspring. Physical contact initiated by subject and juvenile. Juvenile displays curiosity and lack of fear toward human observer. Emotional response significant. Observation. Subject's maternal status confirmed. Maintain non-disclosure of precise location specifics to protect welfare. Signed. She did not retreat into shyness or fear. Instead, she walked around the porch and settled herself so that the small one could explore the edge of the tiled stove and the pattern of the window panes. She watched with a patience that seemed to contain both centuries and the immediate, urgent love of a mother. Once, when the small one tried to reach the carved bone that sat on the table, she made a soft noise and gently nipped the youngster's shoulder in a corrective, affectionate way. The small one obliged with a small reluctant whimper, and then in a gesture that I have no language for except family, it took another step and placed both hands on my knees. The night melted into a kind of domestic choreography that made me dizzy with the ordinary miracle of it. I brewed tea and left a bowl of water for the pair. She allowed the child to drink, and then nudged the bowl toward the edge so I could fill it again. Later, when the small one dozed, she rested her forehead against my knuckle and made a long sound that might have been a word for home, had she the human language to hand it. There is in such instances a sense of ethical reckoning that goes beyond the ledger. The presence of offspring changes the terms of stewardship. Protecting one creature is one thing. Protecting a lineage is another. That night on the porch, I felt the consequence of my earlier choices. Secrecy had protected a life and made possible another. But secrecy can be brittle. That same privacy, if it had been flung to the winds at the wrong time, might have doomed both. I tucked the carved bone back into my palm. Its new notch lay visible in the light, a mark that now felt like a seal. My fingers moved to add a small notch of my own, not as an alteration, but as an acknowledgement. I thought of Sarah, and of the particular steadfastness of human love, and I bowed my head for a minute, as if to a prayer. Personal file. Nov. 4, 2008. Offspring documented. Interaction peaceful. Subject maintains proximity to human habitation but exhibits no aggressive behavior. Consideration. Offspring presence increases imperative for protection. Recommend continued secrecy about specific location and thoughtful consideration of long-term conservation measures that avoid public exposure. Signed. The reunion did not erase the world's appetite for spectacle. The mountain has a rumor mill and people are always looking for stories that will confirm what they hope to find. I had come to understand, through the slow amassing of years, that it is not enough to keep a secret. It must be sustained through deliberate care. I elected, then and there on that step, to keep a watch in a different register. Not as a man with keys and authority, but as a neighbor in quiet, a steward of a trust. I visited them across many seasons. I learned the child's particular tendencies, a fascination with stones, an incline toward imprinting patterns of sticks into circles, and an ability to mimic a certain sharp bark. I taught it out of habit. The adult taught the child to avoid certain trails, to use soft footfalls, to know when to make themselves scarce. There were moments of wild play. The child would chase Duke in a slow, considerate game, or the two would sit and watch the sky, sharing a silence that was easy and old. There were other moments of tension. Hunters still came, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone. I would find snares reset in distant gullies, left as if to test me. I became adept at the kind of small warfare that consists of dismantling traps, masking trails, and setting up decoys of smell that misled curious dogs. I recorded every incident in the file with a kind of religious precision, not to create a dossier for fame, but to have a chronology in case someone needed to act with prudence. My handwriting grew more economical as I aged. My observations, however, retained their exactness. Personal file. June 12, 2012. Continued observation indicates stable family unit. Ongoing risks, intermittent trespassers and illegal trapping attempts. Remedial actions undertaken, removal of traps, altering scent trails, establishing false traces to mislead. Notes. Ensure no public dissemination that could lead to increased human interference. Signed. The law had its own slow-motion progress. The men I had helped arrest earlier were out. They lived different lives in a valley where time has a way of making certain things unremarkable. I made a point now and then of walking the lower trail and exchanging a word with the deputies, not to boast but to remind myself that the law is a blunt instrument that requires caretakers who are more patient in particular than enforcement alone. I worked with deputies at the edges to improve patrol patterns, asked them to be mindful of privacy, and they, in turn, learned enough to ask fewer questions. One spring, a university team sent through a local researcher asked me if I knew of any unusual fauna in the district for a paper. I declined. My training had taught me to weigh an answer against the long shadow of its consequences. I refused out of the same ethical impulse that had kept me quiet for years. To reveal was to risk harm. To remain silent was to accept a burden I had chosen. There were consequences. I grew more solitary in my days, more deliberate with whom I trusted. My children came occasionally, and when they met the pair at the edge of the meadow for the first time, they were as flummoxed as I had been years before. Jennifer cried when the child placed a small hand against her palm and left a smudge of sap on her skin. Marcus laughed, then watched with an attention that made him feel very young. Those visits were small, human celebrations of a private miracle. Time does not proceed with the gentle arc we sometimes imagine. It rips and smooths and leaves you different. I grew older. The carved bone spent its life warming in my pocket when I walked, and its notch deepened from handling. I wrote the file in fits and starts, sometimes in neat script and sometimes in angry, frustrated scrawl when traps proliferated and human indifference threatened what I had promised to protect. I would read it in the late hours and remember the smell of soap when I had first washed that wound, the small sound she made when the wire had been cut. Those small memories kept the story honest. The irony in keeping the file closed for so long is that secrecy required faith. Faith that others would not stumble across the place. Faith that the mountain could hold that privacy. Faith that the offspring would not be discovered by a stranger's lens. Each year, each season, tested that faith. There were close calls. Hunters who came too near. A weekend party that set up a camp within earshot. A logging company that sent a survey crew near the lower ridge and left behind a stake. In each instance, I moved like a careful hand, patching and rerouting, like a gardener tending a rare and fragile plant. Personal file, Sept 21, 2016. Sustained observation suggests continuing stability of family unit. Noted recurring risk, public curiosity following regional trail closures and resource surveys. Recommendation, strengthen confidential coordination with local enforcement and conservation groups to provide non-public protection measures. Signed. As I began to age into the kind of man who checks his joints when he stands, it became clearer to me that carrying secrecy forever would one day pass the duty to hands that had not understood it. There is a line where secrecy becomes hoarding and where protection becomes possessiveness. In conversations I had with myself on cold nights, I sketched out plans that might allow for a longer-term protective posture without turning the creatures involved into curiosities. I thought of conservation easements, of quiet protections tacked behind public-facing programs, of education that did not invite voyeurism. Those ideas lived at the margins of the file like tentative seedlings. When the time came for me to think about the endgame, it did not present itself as a single decision, but as a constellation of small truths. The first truth was that I had watched a life be lived and had been entrusted with a portion of it. The second was that my stewardship had protected not just an adult's life, but a lineage. The third was that the best protection I could offer now was stories and names in the right place, testimony that would not lead to spectacle, guidance for those who might protect in steadier, less exposed ways. That is why, in the end, I am opening this file. Not because I think the world needs the proof of what I saw. It does not. My purpose is not to convince an audience that the mountain once housed a thing we lacked a catalog for. It is to set down, in a public way, the ethical shape of my choice. To say plainly, I chose to protect, and that choosing was not without cost. I chose to be silent, because silence was the merciful option in the face of a brutal curiosity. I chose retirement because it freed me to be the kind of watcher I needed to be, without putting the creature at greater risk. I chose secrecy, because the alternative would have been exploitation. Personal file, June 1, 2020. File opened for public statement by author and former agent. Purpose, testimony, ethical reflection, and request for respectful stewardship by those who would hear. Note, precise location withheld to prevent harm. Signed. There are questions readers will have and ones they won't voice. People will want coordinates and photographs and DNA samples. They will press, and some will find the lack of concrete proof unsatisfying. I will not provide those things. My file was never intended as evidence for tribunals or tabloids. It was a record for the conscience. If the world insists on a ledger of proof, I will leave that conversation to those better suited for it. For me, the aim is to narrate a moral experiment. What happens when a man keeps a promise to protect a life that the rest of his world may not recognize? When I tell the story now, I cannot avoid the ache of Sarah's absence. On the porch years ago, when she leaned her head against my boot, I thought of how she had been a bridge. She had been a person who taught me how to tether grief to kindness. The creature taught me in different ways how to keep faith alive in the face of loss. We taught one another care, and that is a rare and invaluable thing. On my last visit, before I sealed the final notes of this file, the adult came to me and placed a fresh token at my feet. It was not a bone this time, but a strip of braided grass, tied in a small knot with a curl that suggested something like a signature. The child's hand reached and touched my knee and then, without ceremony, took my fingers in both small palms. I will never forget the way that palm fit around my finger, the way it asked for nothing and gave the permission of trust. I have decided to release this testimony now because I am no longer able to guarantee the indefinite continuation of my personal watch. My children are older and less present than I once hoped. The valley is changed by roads that carry more people, and the world is louder. It is time that the ethical considerations that guided me have company, people who can steward the obligation beyond my life. I do not expect fame. I do not expect easy answers. I expect, if anything, the thin, steady murmur of responsible curiosity. To anyone who hears these words, here is what I ask. Do not seek the precise locations I describe. Do not attempt to track or bait or lure. If you are a person who cares about living beings, take the long view. Conservation is a patient art. Let professionals with the right training be the ones to think about intervention. If you find yourself moved, let your movement be toward building systems that protect, rather than exploit, hidden lives. Personal file, final entry. This statement is offered as the testimony of a retired agent and a former ranger. It contains observations made in good faith, recorded contemporaneously where possible, and preserved in order to bear witness to a life I had the honor to protect. I do not claim institutional sanction. I claim only the weight of my memory and the accountability of a man who kept a promise. I place this file in the open not to invite an industry of curiosity, but to hand the record to conscience. There are truths that, in their gentleness, resist being displayed. There are friendships that are made of small repeated acts rather than grand declarations. I have kept this secret longer than most would advise. I have carried it as my own. In doing so, I tried to reduce harm, to prevent spectacle, and to preserve a family that had no courthouse to bless it. As I close this file for the last time, I feel the weight lift slightly and settle into the world like a bird finding its branch. I will continue to visit when I can, to leave small tokens of food and to watch from respectful distance. I will not publish coordinates. I will not sell stories. What I offer is testimony and a plea. Treat what you do not understand with the same gentleness you would ask for if the roles were reversed. If this testimony has moved you, if you feel as I do that certain things deserve quiet guardianship rather than spectacle, please consider supporting efforts that protect habitat and reduce poaching and illegal trappings. And if you wish to hear other accounts like this, first-hand files by people who have been the reluctant custodians of strange and fragile things, subscribe and listen with the care this subject demands. What we do with knowledge says a great deal about who we are. Signed, William Hart, retired agent, keeper of a file that was never meant to be seen until now.